It was a Sunday evening and I was sitting in my favorite chair listening to the quiet hum of the house. That's when I overheard him, my own son, talking to his wife, mocking me. "He's just a burden eating and taking up space," he said. The words hit harder than I expected, cutting through the silence. But it wasn't the end. Far from it. Have you ever felt like you were just not needed anymore? I had been living in this house for years, a house I'd built from the ground up. But now I was nothing more than a guest. It felt as though my very presence was nothing but an inconvenience. I wanted to speak, to shout to make it stop, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed in my chair pretending I hadn't heard, pretending it didn't matter. But it did. The next few days were strange. No one mentioned what happened. There was no apology, no acknowledgement. But there didn't need to be. It was in every glance they avoided, every word they didn't say. The tension was thick, like a storm hanging over us, waiting to break. "Can we talk about it?" I asked one evening, trying to force the words out. David just shook his head, his eyes darting to the floor. "Not now, Dad. Maybe later." His wife didn't even look up from her phone. I tried to push the thought away, tried to convince myself it didn't matter. After all, this was my family, wasn't it? The family I'd spent my whole life trying to build, to protect. But now I was the outsider, a burden. I couldn't shake it. It wasn't just the words that stung, it was the weight of what came next. Rumors spread like wildfire. It wasn't just them. People at work, acquaintances, even strangers there were whispers. And I knew what they were saying. I wasn't just an aging father anymore. I was the old man who had outlived his usefulness. The burden no one knew what to do with. Then there was Tom. He worked with me at the firm, and had always been the kind of guy who had a knack for reading people. "You can't keep letting them walk all over you, you know," he said one day, sitting down beside me in the break room, his voice low. "You've done enough. Maybe it's time to take control back." The days that followed that moment felt like walking on a tightrope, unsure of whether I'd find solid ground or fall. The house, which once felt like a home, now seemed like a prison with invisible bars. No one brought up what had happened, and yet everything felt different. The casual conversations, the small gestures, they all felt off, like an actor forgetting their lines on stage. David and Sarah no longer made eye contact with me. If I spoke, they'd nod without really listening, or their voices would go silent, waiting for me to leave the room. Even the smallest of interactions felt strained, like we were all walking around a ticking clock, afraid of what would happen when it finally went off. The walls seemed to close in tighter each day. I sat at the dinner table watching them avoid looking at me. The food tasted bland, but I forced myself to swallow. Each bite felt like a reminder that I was still here, still fighting to hold on to something that was slipping away. But what was I holding on to? There were so many unsaid things between us, so many years of unspoken tension. I had worked my whole life to make this family strong, to protect them, but now I was the one being pushed to the edges. I wasn't sure anymore if I could keep pretending it was okay. Every night I'd lie in bed, the silence pressing down on me. The more I thought about it, the more confused I became. Maybe they're right. Maybe I am just a burden. Maybe I should leave. What if I'm overreacting? I wanted to scream, but I kept it all in. What good would it do to get angry? To shout and cause a scene? All I could do was swallow it down and hope the pressure would ease. But it didn't. Then the whispers started. It wasn't just David and Sarah anymore. My colleagues at work began to look at me differently. I could see it in their eyes, the pity, the doubt. It wasn't just in my family that I was starting to fade. It was everywhere. The unspoken words were spreading like a sickness creeping through the air. Rumors about my marriage, about my finances, about my worth. Tom, my old friend from work, was the first to pull me aside. He was the one person who could see through the facade. "You don't have to take it," he said, his voice low but firm. "You've put in your time. You've done enough. Maybe it's time to take control back." I didn't answer right away. What could I say? I had no idea how to fix it, let alone what taking control even looked like anymore. All I knew was that I was suffocating. There was a knot in my stomach every time I walked into the office, like everyone was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I could feel the weight of their eyes on me, watching, judging. I was sure they could see how broken I felt, how much I was trying to keep it together. But the cracks were showing, and no matter how hard I tried to hide them, they were starting to spread. And yet I said nothing. I kept walking the tightrope. Every morning I'd put on my suit, pretend like everything was fine, and go to work as if my life hadn't just crumbled into 1,000 pieces. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, but somehow I managed to keep up the act. No one asked, and I didn't offer. The truth was too much to share. At home, it wasn't any better. If anything, it was worse. The tension in the house had grown so thick I could cut it with a knife. There were moments when David and Sarah would look at me as though I wasn't even there. They no longer saw me as a father, as a man with a voice. They saw me as someone to ignore, to silence. "Dad, you're still here," David muttered one morning, his voice colder than I'd ever heard. It wasn't a question, it wasn't a statement. It was more like a realization, something he hadn't quite expected but had to reluctantly accept. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Everything inside me screamed to stand up to fight back. But what would that accomplish, I thought? Would they even care? In the evenings, I'd retreat to my office as far away from them as I could get. Sometimes Tom's words echoed in my head, urging me to do something. Take control. But what was there left to take control of? They had taken it all. The house, the family, the respect, everything was slipping through my fingers. Even though I knew I couldn't keep living like this, the question of what to do next paralyzed me. Do I take the first step toward ending this, or do I keep pretending, keep swallowing the bitter pills of their neglect? The longer I waited, the more everything started to unravel. But I still couldn't decide. Maybe it wasn't just fear. Maybe it was the years of habit, of putting others first, of sacrificing my needs for theirs. The phone call came on a rainy Thursday afternoon. A voice I didn't recognize on the other end of the line, anonymous low, spoke in a hurry, almost as though they were afraid someone might overhear. "I know what's going on, Charles," the voice said, sharp enough to make my stomach twist. "David's been making plans, not just for the house, but for everything. He's been using you all this time. You're being pushed out, and he's making sure no one notices." My pulse quickened. For a moment, I didn't know how to react. Was this some kind of prank? Or worse, was it someone who'd been listening in on our conversations? But the voice on the other end seemed genuine, too genuine to be ignored. I tried to get more details, but the caller hung up before I could ask anything else. I stood there holding the phone in my hand, mind racing. Was I imagining this? Could it be true? David had always been distant, but the thought of him manipulating things for his own gain? That was hard to swallow. Had I really been so blind, or had I simply refused to see? The next morning, while the weight of the call still sat heavily in my chest, I received a follow-up. A poorly printed, blurry document slipped through the door. No return address, just a small note. It was a copy of a conversation, a record of something I'd never seen, before David, discussing taking control of the house, mentioning that he had everything in place to make sure I was gone, legally and financially. It confirmed my worst fears. He had been planning this. I wasn't just a burden to him anymore. I was an obstacle. Sitting down at the kitchen table, the paper in my hands, I felt like the ground beneath me was crumbling. The walls seemed to close in on me. The house that I had worked so hard to build wasn't mine anymore. It was David's. It always had been. And here I was trying to pretend I still belonged. I started to doubt myself. Am I overreacting? Is this really what's happening? Maybe I was reading too much into it. I thought back on all the years, the sacrifices I'd made, the moments when I'd pushed aside my own feelings for the sake of peace. Was it all just me being foolish? Had I let my own insecurities cloud my judgment? But no matter how hard I tried to convince myself that I might be wrong, the evidence kept piling up. The document wasn't the only thing I'd received. There were more whispers, gossip in the office, subtle comments from colleagues as though they knew something was off, but no one was willing to confront it directly. My reputation was being chipped away, slowly, methodically. David had started taking control, not just at home, but at work, too. The weekly meetings I used to attend were now suddenly off-limits. Documents that had always been available to me were no longer accessible. Everything was locked down, and I was kept out of the loop. It was clear that David's influence had extended beyond the home and into the business. Slowly, the pieces started to fit together. This wasn't just a family issue, it was a power play. And I was losing. I wasn't just being ignored anymore, I was being erased. But I wasn't ready to be a ghost. Not yet. One night after the house had gone still, and the air was thick with tension, I started taking action. Quietly, when no one was looking, I began recording conversations with David, with Sarah, even with the housekeeper who seemed to know more than she let on. I kept the recordings hidden, a secret of my own. I wasn't sure yet what I was going to do with them, but I couldn't just let this happen without a fight. I also started gathering all the documents I could find. Anything that proved I was entitled to this house, to the life I had built. It wasn't just about the house, it was about respect. It was about holding on to something that had been mine before they ever came into the picture. There was no turning back now. I had to be ready. But the longer I watched David tighten his grip, the more I realized just how far he would go to push me out. His tactics were subtle, never too obvious, but they were there. Every move he made was designed to isolate me, to make me feel small, to ensure I stayed silent and out of the way. But I wasn't going to let him do this to me. Not again. I started making calls, arranging meetings with my lawyer, reconnecting with old friends who could back me up. It felt strange, almost like I was playing a game I hadn't been prepared for. But as I took more steps to protect myself, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. Not the kind of control David had been stealing from me, but the kind I could take back. David finally made it clear. There were no more subtle hints, no more half-hearted words. He was done hiding behind the facade of politeness. I walked into the living room that evening expecting another round of tense silence, but instead he looked me square in the eye and said it without any trace of hesitation. "You need to leave," he stated flatly, his tone more like an order than a request. "This house isn't yours anymore. You've had your time. It's over." I froze for a moment, trying to process what he just said. This was no longer a conversation about differences in opinion or misunderstandings. This was his declaration. A line drawn in the sand. "David, you can't just—" "No," he cut me off, his voice rising now. "You don't get to talk. You've had your chance to be a part of this. Now you're just a weight. You need to go. This is my decision." It wasn't just the words that struck me, but the finality in his voice. There was no softness, no room for negotiation. I could see it in his eyes. He had already decided. There was no place for me here anymore. I remained silent, watching him closely. Sarah stood by the doorway, her arms crossed, avoiding my gaze. She didn't speak, but her presence, her silence was enough. She was complicit in this. The world around me felt as if it had shifted. The place I had once called home was no longer mine. David wasn't asking me to leave. He was demanding it. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I just stood there processing the reality of the situation. There was a coldness in his words, an icy certainty that I couldn't ignore. "Are you sure about this?" I asked. "Is this really how you want to handle it?" David didn't answer. He didn't need to. His face told me everything. He was done, and I was the one who had overstayed my welcome. There was nothing left for me here. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. This wasn't a moment for anger. It was a moment for strategy. For the first time in a long while, I realized that I had no choice but to react, but not with the same impulsive anger that I had felt rising in my chest. No, I needed to think. He had made his move, and I needed to make mine. But how I couldn't just roll over and accept it. I had spent my life building a legacy, and I wasn't about to lose it all just because my son decided I was no longer worth his time. I had fought too long, too hard to let him erase me from everything I had worked for. But I wasn't going to make the same mistake I'd made before. I couldn't afford to act on impulse. I needed a plan. The next day, David's actions continued. He went behind my back, making decisions about the house and the assets, things I had a right to, things I had worked for. His attempts to isolate me became more apparent. He cut me off from important meetings at the office, limiting my access to crucial information. Each time I tried to speak up, he dismissed me with a wave of his hand or a condescending remark. He was making sure everyone knew who was in charge. I knew what was happening. This was his way of ensuring that I couldn't fight back. But it also made me realize something. He was afraid. Afraid that I might still have something he couldn't control. And that fear, his fear, was the key. Took a step back and thought carefully. What was it I could do? How could I take back what was rightfully mine without giving in to the rage building inside me? I began to gather information, small things at first. Documents, emails, anything I could find that proved my claim to the house. I had to be strategic. Every move I made had to count. I also started documenting conversations. I recorded meetings, discussions with David, even casual chats with Sarah. They had no idea, but I knew that sooner or later, I would need every scrap of evidence I could gather. But the deeper I got into this, the more I realized the battle was no longer just about a house or a few assets. It was about respect. It was about my place in this world, my dignity. David had tried to take that from me, but he couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't going to let him. The email came through early one morning, its subject line cryptic enough to make my heart skip a beat. "I know what's happening." The message was from an anonymous sender, no name attached, just a string of words that hit harder than I expected. "It's not just the house, Charles," the message read. "David's been planning to cut you out completely. He's been manipulating everything behind the scenes. His move is already in play." I stared at the screen for several moments, feeling the weight of those words sink in. This wasn't just about me getting older or being a burden. David was playing a much larger game, one I hadn't fully realized until now. The pieces were clearer, though I'd been blind to them for so long. And now I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The note included something else, a screenshot of an email exchange between David and his lawyer. The subject, finalizing the removal plan. It was about the house, the assets, and my complete exclusion from any future decisions regarding our finances. The conversation wasn't direct, but the implications were clear. They were making moves behind my back. They were pushing me out of every part of this life I'd built. Sat at the kitchen table, shaking, holding my phone in my hands. The walls felt like they were closing in. My stomach twisted and I felt an anger rising, but it was quickly overtaken by something else, doubt. I had missed so much. All those quiet, careful conversations David had with Sarah, things I thought were just routine private discussions. They were more than that. They were part of a plan, a calculated effort to strip me of everything. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it anymore. I needed to act. But what did I do next, Tom? My old friend from work was the only person I'd confided in. He had been watching all of this unfold, and he wasn't surprised by the details I had shared with him. "You've been too passive for too long," he said when I called him. "Now it's time to do something about it. You're not going to get anywhere if you stay silent. Trust me, you've earned your place here, and no one, especially David, has the right to take that from you." He wasn't wrong. I knew it deep down. Every instinct I had told me that this had gone too far. But I still hesitated. The idea of confronting David directly, of standing up to him after all these years, it felt impossible. Yet if I didn't take action, I risked losing everything. Not just the house, but my dignity, my sense of self. I could already see how far David had gone, spreading rumors, isolating me, pushing me out of the circle, and making me question my own worth. I spent the next few days gathering whatever evidence I could. Phone calls, documents, records, anything that could prove I wasn't just a passive bystander in this twisted play. But while I was focused on building my case, I started to see the bigger picture. David wasn't just pushing me out physically. He was working to dismantle my credibility, to make sure no one believed me if I ever tried to stand up. In the office, colleagues began treating me with a growing sense of doubt. My reputation was crumbling, one whispered conversation at a time. One afternoon, Sarah pulled me aside, her face tight with discomfort. She had that look, the one she always wore when something was wrong, but she didn't know how to fix it. "You need to understand something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "David's been under a lot of pressure. This is his way of fixing things." I wanted to shout, to tell her how ridiculous that sounded, fixing things. Was this how he fixed things, by stripping me of my place in this family? But I didn't. I just nodded, the rage building in my chest, and forced myself to stay calm. When I left her, I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about the house anymore. This was about my place in their lives, my role as their father, as the person who had always been the pillar of the family. And it was clear now that I wasn't just being ignored. I was being erased. But I wasn't ready to let it happen. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't let them take everything from me without a fight. I had been passive for too long. And now, as the walls closed in, I saw my only option: stand up, take control, and confront David head on. The decision wasn't easy. Every part of me wanted to just walk away, to leave them to it, to accept that my time had passed. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. David might have thought he had already won, but he hadn't. Not yet. He was pushing me into a corner, but I had my own weapons now: proof, truth, and a resolve that had been buried too long. I wasn't going to let him win. I was done letting him control the narrative. By the time I had gathered enough evidence, there was no turning back. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I needed a strategy, something more than just keeping the truth in my back pocket. It was time to fight back, and I wasn't going to do it carelessly. The first step was clear. I needed to gather all the necessary documents, phone records, emails, anything that could provide a solid case. I reached out to an old lawyer friend, someone who'd helped me in the past, but had no clue what I was truly dealing with now. Tom had been right. I had been too passive for too long. My emotions, anger, frustration had clouded my judgment. I needed to turn them off. I couldn't afford to let any of it affect my next moves. So I pushed them down, focusing instead on gathering the tools I'd need for the battle ahead. Tom had given me a starting point. "You've got a right to everything you built. Get it back before it's too late." I met with him once more to talk about my next steps. "Start reaching out to people who might still be on your side," he advised. "You need to restore your connections. There are people you've known for years who'll back you up." It made sense. David had worked hard to sever those ties, but I still had a few key people left in my corner. "Do you think they'll still listen?" I asked, wondering just how much of my reputation David had already destroyed. Tom nodded. You've got to try. If they care about you, they'll listen. It wasn't just about saving the house anymore. It was about my identity, my ability to stand on my own without being controlled by my son. I couldn't let him strip me of that. I started reconnecting with those I'd lost contact with, old colleagues, distant family members, friends from the past, who remembered the person I used to be. One by one, they started agreeing to meet with me. I carefully laid out the facts slowly, without overwhelming them, showing the evidence in small doses, letting it sink in. I needed them to see it clearly, to know that this wasn't a fight about material things, but about something much deeper: respect. At the same time, the atmosphere around me was growing more hostile. David wasn't done yet. His control over the house and everything else had become more apparent. He was moving fast, too fast. I couldn't keep up with all the changes. Important meetings at work were still being kept from me. Documents that I had the right to access were mysteriously unavailable. And the most infuriating part, every time I asked about anything, he would brush me off like I didn't matter anymore. There were moments when I wanted to lash out, when the frustration almost bubbled over. But I stopped myself. I had a bigger goal now. It wasn't just the house I was fighting for. It was the way he was trying to erase me from everything I had built, from my family, my career, my sense of self. This wasn't about a piece of property. It was about me reclaiming my life, my dignity. But just when I thought I had control over the situation, the first signs of real danger appeared. One afternoon, my phone buzzed. A strange number, no message. I ignored it. But as the days passed, it kept happening. Calls in the middle of the night, anonymous messages with threatening undertones. Stop digging into things or it'll cost you one read. Another simply said, "You're being watched." I hadn't done anything to provoke this. At least I didn't think I had. But I knew one thing for sure: David was escalating things, trying to intimidate me into backing down. He wasn't going to stop until he had what he wanted. But I wasn't going to let him win. I was ready to play this game by his rules, but on my terms. The more he pushed, the more determined I became. I took steps to cover my tracks, to make sure that every piece of evidence I gathered was securely hidden. I knew I couldn't just keep playing it safe. I still had a few more people to talk to, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy. But I also knew that this was the point where everything changed. This was where I stopped being the victim and started being the one in control. By the time I had everything in place, the final step became clear. I couldn't keep waiting. It was time to make my move. As the tension in the air grew thicker, so did the weight of the decisions I had made. I realized that if I didn't act now, I'd lose everything, not just my place in the house, but my place in my own life. The moment had arrived. The day I had been dreading finally arrived. The phone rang early in the morning, and when I answered, the voice on the other end made my stomach drop. "Mr. Harris, we need to inform you about a legal matter," the voice said, crisp and professional. "There's a lawsuit filed against you regarding your ownership of the property on West End Road. It's been brought to the courts by your son, David Harris." I couldn't speak for a moment. The words felt like a physical blow. A lawsuit. David had taken it this far. He wasn't just pushing me out of the house, he was taking everything from me. The house, the legacy, the life I had built, it was all slipping through my fingers. "Do you have an attorney representing you?" the voice continued. I barely managed to respond. "Yes, I do." After hanging up, I sat there, the weight of the situation crashing down on me. I had spent my entire life building this house, and now it was all at risk. David wasn't just fighting for control over the house, he was fighting for everything. And I was standing in the middle of it, with nothing but the wreckage of a family I didn't recognize anymore. I paced the room, trying to wrap my mind around the reality. How could he do this? We'd been through so much together. Sure, things had been strained, but this was betrayal. It was an attack. It wasn't just about money or property. It was about power control, and David had made his move. The shock was wearing off, replaced by an icy resolve. I had been avoiding this for so long, but now there was no more hiding. I had to act, and I had to act fast. David had made sure of that. This lawsuit wasn't just a legal challenge, it was a direct assault on my life, my dignity, my identity. I felt cornered, trapped. But I had no choice now. I had to fight back. David's next move came soon after. As I sat at my desk, preparing for what would undoubtedly be a long battle, I got another call. This time it wasn't a lawyer, but an old colleague, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. Charles. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news. His voice crackled through the phone. But I think you should know there's been talk at the office. David's been telling people you're, well, not quite capable of handling things anymore. He's been putting your name down on some bad deals, making sure you're not part of any decisions. I felt my blood run cold. David was trying to ruin my professional reputation as well. Every move he made was to isolate me, to cut me off from everything. First the house. Now my career. I didn't respond right away, but I knew what I had to do. The house wasn't just a building. It was a symbol of my life's work. I couldn't let him take that from me. It wasn't just the house either. I was losing everything, my career, my dignity, the trust of people I had worked with for years. But I wasn't going to let David control the narrative any longer. I spent the next few days preparing. I contacted my lawyer, met with a financial advisor, and spoke to a few people I trusted, trying to get a handle on the damage David was doing. The more I learned, the more I realized the depth of his manipulation. He had planned this for months, probably longer. One by one, I reached out to the people David had isolated me from: colleagues, friends, even family. Some had heard the rumors, but others were just as surprised as I was by the allegations. The harder I worked to repair the damage, the more I saw David's true intentions. This wasn't about a simple dispute over a house. It was about power. The next meeting I had with my lawyer was pivotal. The lawsuit had been filed, but I wasn't backing down. I had already started compiling my own evidence, piecing together documents, emails, and anything else that might prove David's manipulations. I wasn't just going to fight him on this house, I was going to take him down piece by piece. You've got a solid case, my lawyer said, looking over the documents I'd brought him. It's going to be a tough fight, Charles, but if we can prove his intentions, we can take this all the way. I'm ready, I replied, my voice steady. Whatever it takes. The house was gone, along with everything I thought was secure. David had tried to take everything from me, and for a while it seemed like he might win. But something had shifted within me. I was no longer that man who just took what came, hoping to keep the peace. The fight had drained me emotionally and physically, but I realized something as I watched the final pieces fall into place. The only way forward was through acceptance. Not of David's actions, but of what I had allowed to happen. I had spent so many years trying to be everything for everyone, trying to make them proud, trying to keep the family together. But in doing that, I'd lost sight of myself. I had forgotten that my worth wasn't measured by what I gave or how much I endured. It wasn't about pleasing them anymore. It was about finding the strength to walk away when I knew the fight was over. David's actions weren't just a betrayal. They were the catalyst for my transformation. The quiet, subtle moments of frustration that I had bottled up for years finally broke free. I wasn't going to be the man who just bowed his head and accepted whatever was thrown at him anymore. I could choose to let this define me, or I could choose to let it go. And that's what I did. I had made my peace with the fact that David and I could never be the same. The damage was too deep, the trust too broken. I had hoped for a reconciliation, but now I realized it wasn't meant to be. The courts had sided with me, confirming my right to the house. David's scheme had crumbled, but the victory felt hollow. The truth was, it wasn't about the house anymore. It wasn't about the money, the assets, or the power. It was about getting back to myself, about remembering who I was before all of this chaos consumed me. "I can't keep doing this," I had said to Sarah one evening, my voice steady. "I've tried for too long. It's time to move on. I'm done fighting for things that don't deserve my time." She looked at me, her face a mixture of sadness and resignation. I wish things could have been different. But I was done. Done with trying to salvage relationships that were never truly mine to keep. Done with holding on to a family that didn't want to stay together. It wasn't easy. It wasn't something I wanted, but it was necessary. I knew what I had to do now. I didn't need anyone's permission. I didn't need their validation. I had spent too many years seeking their approval, thinking it was the only way I'd ever be enough. But now I was learning that the only approval I needed was my own. I packed up my things, leaving behind the house that no longer felt like home. I couldn't stay in a place where every corner reminded me of the battle I had lost or thought I had lost. "I'll be okay," I said to Tom, as I handed him the last few files I had gathered. "I've finally accepted that this is what it is, and I'm moving forward." Tom gave me a supportive nod, but I could see the worry in his eyes. "You don't have to do this alone, you know." "I know," I replied, smiling slightly. "But it's time for me to start over. For myself." It was time to let go. Let go of the past, of the expectations, of the guilt. There was nothing left for me in the life I had been living. And as I stepped out of that house, I realized it wasn't just about letting go of the house, it was about letting go of everything that had held me back. I made the decision to move to a new place, away from the memories that clung to every wall. I didn't want to escape, but I wanted a fresh start. I needed it. I began working on projects that mattered to me not because I had to, but because they brought me joy. I started volunteering, offering my time to causes I believed in. For the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something for myself. David had finally gotten what he wanted. He had taken the house, but in the end, it wasn't enough. I didn't need the house. I didn't need the family that had betrayed me. What I needed was my own peace, my own freedom. I found that peace in small, quiet moments, sitting on a park bench, watching the sun set, breathing in the fresh air. I found it in the work I did, the people I met, the friends I reconnected with. Life had started again for me, not in the grand gestures or the big victories, but in the calm that settled into my soul. David's consequences were coming. The courts, his colleagues, the community, everything he had worked to control was unraveling. But that was no longer my fight. I had chosen to move on. I had chosen myself. And that was the most important decision I'd ever made.